Chapter 21 The Indolent Emperor Honorius. You are listening at novelfull.audio. In Ravenna, within the royal palace of the Western Roman Empire, lie a young man in his early 20s. This man had a rather unkempt appearance, and at first glance, one might assume he was a mere vagrant rather than an emperor. However, he was, in fact, the man who ruled over the Western Roman Empire. Emperor Honorius was a man who had never lifted a finger in his life to do the work that was required of him. Instead, he had left the ruling of his realm up to a series of advisors, many of which were corrupt officials and sycophants. It was partially because of this that the empire was in such a sorry state. Thus, it came as no surprise that while his empire collapsed around him, Honorius was sitting back on a sofa, drinking a chalice of wine and playing with his pet chicken. While Honorius was gazing at his chicken with a dull expression, he listened to the report of his supreme commander, who informed the young emperor about the disaster that was the campaign in Gaul. In all honesty, Honorius could not care less, which was evident by his behavior as he merely sighed in exhaustion while Stilicho rambled on about their losses. "Your Highness, the campaign in Gaul has resulted in defeat. Though we made initial gains and were close to achieving our goal of overthrowing the usurper. In the end, our army suffered horrific losses and was forced to return to the Italian peninsula. These men even endured humiliation at the hands of the Bugatti as they forced our returning soldiers to pay a toll for safe passage to our lands." Honorius did not immediately react to this news, and instead reached into his sack of chicken feed and tossed it towards the beast that was his favorite pet. A dull smile formed on the emperor's face as he did so. For the briefest of moments, his perpetual boredom had been lifted. That is, until Stilicho raised his voice, questioning the emperor's idle attitude. "Your Highness. How shall we respond?" Honorius glared at Stilicho with a furious gaze. The man just had to keep talking about Gaul and the usurper, none of which he actually cared about. Could he not have anything more interesting to discuss? It was this line of thought that caused Honorius to answer the man vaguely so he could keep playing with his chicken. "I don't care. Do whatever you feel is appropriate. Just make sure to thoroughly punish the imbecile who caused our defeat. Seriously, is it that hard to get rid of one stupid usurper?" The emperor spoke as if he were an expert on military matters, which clearly he was not. Despite this insult, Stilicho choked down his pride and bowed his head, requesting leniency on behalf of Marcellus. "With all due respect, Your Highness, I implore you to show mercy. The general I sent to Gaul is one of our best officers, and he is a rising talent. The only reason the enemy was able to defeat him was because he had received misinformation from his scouts. If not for this fact, the usurper's allies would not have been able to surround his army." It took little to convince Honorius to spare Marcellus. After all, the man did not care in the slightest about this issue. He was more concerned about why his wine had gone dry. "Fine, I won't claim his head for his defeat, but at the very least he should be lashed a few times for making such a foolish mistake." Stilicho sighed in relief when he heard the emperor's response. Honorius was a man who acted upon his worst impulses. If he was in a particularly foul mood, he easily would have demanded for a severe punishment to be inflicted upon Marcellus. Luckily, Stilicho had approached the man while he was in the middle of playing with his pet, otherwise he was certain Marcellus would have surely suffered. Stilicho bowed his head once more before he thanked Honorius for his benevolence. "On behalf of Marcellus, I thank you for your mercy." It was when Honorius heard this name that he suddenly became more interested in the topic at hand. He instantly placed down his empty chalice and shifted his gaze from his pet chicken to his supreme commander with a shocked expression on his face. "Hold on, the general in question is Marcellus. Titus Claudius Marcellus. Your godson." Stilicho raised his head when he heard this. He could tell from the tone in the emperor's voice that he was not pleased. However, he had no choice but to nod his head in admission. When Honorius saw this, a wicked smile curved itself upon his lips. He had known Marcellus for some time. After all, Stilicho had been the man who had helped raise the both of them, thus they were bound to interact with one another. However, unlike Honorius, who was an indolent and foolish drunk, Marcellus was a rising star in the social circles of the Roman elite. He was handsome, wealthy, intelligent, talented, and a skilled military officer who had won many glories for Rome. Even the emperor's own sister would never shut up about Marcellus and his accomplishments on the field of battle. There was a reason Honorius had never given Marcellus a proper victory title, despite being well known as a slayer of Goths. It was because he was envious of the popularity of the man. Out of spite, Honorius had refused to award one of his best generals for his achievements, despite the morale it would bring to his empire. Thus, when he heard that Marcellus was responsible for the defeat in Gaul, he decided to use it as a way to bring shame to the man, and ruin his reputation forever. All of a sudden, he was very interested in the topic of how Rome had been defeated in Gaul. "Stilicho, my old friend. Tell me everything you know about Marcellus and his campaign to Gaul." Stilicho immediately regretted mentioning Marcellus' name to the young emperor, but he had no choice but to comply with his demands. Thus, he spoke about every detail he had learned about the campaign, including the captivity Marcellus was forced to endure after his defeat. When the supreme commander had finally finished telling his tale, Honorius was smiling emphatically. He was truly excited. For the first time he had the ability to drag Marcellus' name through the mud, and he was going to take advantage of it. Thus, all the hard work that Stilicho had gone through to change the narrative about Marcellus' defeat was undone with a simple command. "TSK, TSK, TSK. Marcellus, to think you would insult our empire in such a way for the sake of a simple slave. I'm sorry, but I cannot be lenient. We must make an example of him. I order you to drag Marcellus through the streets of Rome while naked and have him whipped as punishment. Let all see what happens to those who put their personal feelings above the glory of our empire." When Stilicho heard this, he could only sigh in defeat. He really should have left Marcellus' name out of the conversation. It was only now that the man realized he had truly underestimated Honorius' bitter jealousy towards Marcellus. Though he tried his best to calm the emperor's wrath, it was to no avail. "And what of your sister? She lives in Rome. Are you going to force her to bear witness to such a sight? You know how she fancies Marcellus. Such a thing would devastate her." Unfortunately, this was exactly what Honorius wanted, and as such, he wore a sadistic grin while he doubled down on his stance. "Good, that little bitch can see what happens when she puts her faith in a good-for-nothing pretty boy. This is not my fault. Marcellus is the one who failed to fulfill his duty and embarrassed our entire empire. If anything, I am being lenient for the crimes he has committed." In response to this, Stilicho could only sigh in defeat once more. This foolish boy was more concerned about his petty jealousy than about the security of his borders. If the truth of Marcellus' actions were to be revealed, it would forever tarnish his reputation, and in doing so would leave the people of the empire faithless in one of their greatest generals. Such a thing could only have negative consequences for the empire as a whole. However, there was no point debating any further. Honorius was a simple hedonist. Once he found something to entertain himself with, he would see it through. Thus, the emperor had decided to make a proper show of Marcellus' punishment, and he would enjoy every second of it. As for Marcellus, he was peacefully unaware of the hornet's nest he had stepped upon, and was enjoying his free time with his mother and slave at his villa. The young general was completely unaware of the public humiliation that he was about to suffer at the hands of a jealous emperor. Chapter 22 The Emperor's Sister. You are listening at novelfull.audio. A young girl no older than 14 was skipping through the streets of Rome while humming a song. She had long since been cooped up in her own household, and had recently heard news that a close friend had returned from a long campaign. Thus, she had snuck out of her house to go visit the man, even if it was wildly inappropriate for a girl in her position. The petite young girl was slender for her age, and like many Roman women, she had dyed her hair blonde with a mixture made from ashes of plants and nuts. The golden hair contrasted with her light tan skin, and hazel eyes nicely creating a beautiful appearance. If anyone within the city of Rome were to set their eyes upon this girl, they would immediately recognize her as Galla Placidia, the younger half-sister of the Western Roman Emperor Honorius. The girl had a pretty smile on her face as she adjusted her hair before knocking on the door to a magnificent villa which was strategically located just down the road from her own estate. After a few loud strikes, the door opened to reveal a busty blonde woman dressed in the attire of a slave. Placidia immediately recognized this slave girl as her romantic rival, and struggled to maintain her joyous appearance when she laid eyes on the woman. "Oh Sigefrida, I did not expect you to answer the door, so the rumors are true. Marcellus is home." Sigefrida smiled and nodded her head before allowing the young girl into her master's estate. She could not help but compliment the girl's natural charm as she laid eyes on her. "Yes, Marcellus is home. He is currently in a meeting with his mother. I have to say, Placidia, you have grown more beautiful since I last saw you." When Placidia heard Aeliana was at the villa, she immediately felt like making a strategic retreat. Marcellus' mother was a frightening woman, even to the emperor's sister. Despite the effort she had put into her appearance for this occasion, Placidia was quick to slink back towards the door as she attempted to make her escape. "Oh. Aeliana is here. I will just come back some other time then." However, before she could quietly abscond from the scene, Sigefrida had latched onto the girl's forearm and stared at her with a chilling gaze. "Please. Stay. Marcellus will be down in a few moments." Though neither of the two girls were telepathic, in that moment Placidia could fully understand Sigefrida's thoughts, and that was simply, "If I have to endure the bitch's presence, so do you." Thus, Placidia let out a meek voice as the older woman dragged her off towards the dining hall where they waited for Marcellus' arrival. The two of them sat in awkward silence until they could hear the sound of an argument descending the staircase. "Mother, for the last time, you worry too much. I will be fine. Stilicho even said he will smooth things over with the emperor for me." The young general was quickly fleeing his mother's chase. The woman could sometimes drive him crazy with her incessant worrying. Aeliana was not far behind as she scolded her son for his naivety. "You know as well as I do how that foolish boy treats you. The moment he hears you have involved yourself in a scandal, he will make an example of you. Even Stilicho cannot prevent such a thing from occurring." Aeliana was just about to curse the emperor's name when she stepped into the dining hall and witnessed the man's younger sister sitting at the table with a confused expression on her face. "Oh, Placidia, I was not expecting your visit. Please make yourself at home." Despite her words, Aeliana was far from pleased with this occurrence. It was bad enough that she had to monitor her son's activities with his slave, but now the other little harlot who was after her boy's heart was present. Marcellus did not even seem to notice the girl's intentions as he quickly approached Placidia and hugged her. "Placidia, it is nice to see you. Have you grown since the last time we met?" Placidia blushed when she heard this and nodded her head in silence. She always got tongue-tied around Marcellus and had commonly made a fool of herself while in his presence. The two of them had known each other for many years, and if anything, Marcellus considered the girl like a little sister to him. It took some careful untangling, but the girl managed to ask the question on her mind while she shared a platonic embrace with the man. "Marcellus, have you gotten yourself into some trouble?" The young general immediately tried to dodge the question as he shifted his head to the side and released his grip. "It's nothing serious. I'm sure your brother will be lenient." When Placidia heard this, she scoffed before scolding Marcellus for his naivety. "Marcellus, you know my brother is envious of you. No matter what minor offense you have committed, he will do his best to punish you in a way that is truly degrading. Perhaps I can speak up on your behalf. Just what is it that has transpired?" The young general had a hard time admitting to the girl that always looked up to him that he had been captured by a group of peasant insurgents. However, ultimately, he mustered his courage and told the girl the truth. "I may have been taken prisoner so that Sigefrida could avoid the same fate, Placidia immediately covered her mouth in shock. Being captured alive as a general was a great humiliation to Rome, but what Marcellus had done was worse. He had voluntarily become a hostage in exchange for a lowly slave's safety. When she heard this, she could not help but gaze at the woman in question with fury in her eyes. "You let him do such a thing? What were you thinking? Do you have any idea what my brother will do to Marcellus when he finds out?" Siegfrieda hung her head in shame. She had no response to this line of interrogation. Luckily Placidia's wrath was immediately overtaken with concern for Marcellus' safety as she returned her gaze to the man. "Marcellus, I know my brother. He will surely punish you severely for this. Stilicho can't help you. The moment Honorius learns you are the one responsible, he will do everything he can to humiliate you. Perhaps you should flee to Constantinople. I am sure my brother Arcadius would be more than happy to accept you into his service as a general." When Marcellus heard the girl have such concern for him and his reputation, he smiled, while grabbing hold of her cheek with one of his palms. He shook his head as he denied the girl's suggestion. "I have no shame in what I have done. If Honorius seeks to make an example of me, then so be it. I do not care about my reputation so long as I can serve Rome faithfully. I could not live with myself if I fled the consequences of my actions. So long as he does not attempt to claim my life, I will endure whatever cruelty your brother has planned for me." Tears began to well up in Placidia's eyes as she latched onto Marcellus like a lamprey. It was at this moment a knock resounded on the door, causing Siegfrieda to leave the scene and open it. When she returned, there were several armed soldiers by her side. One of them pulled out a scroll and read from it. "Titus Claudius Marcellus, you were wanted for crimes against Rome, for your shameful actions which have brought dishonor to your emperor. You are to be arrested and paraded through the streets of Rome." Marcellus had a bitter smile as he submitted himself to the soldiers who carried away from his villa in chains. Placidia and Aeliana struggled to free him from his bondage, but it was to no avail. They were merely women, and were easily held back by the heavily armed guards as they took Marcellus from his home, and led him to the dungeons. While Marcellus was being led from his house in chains, Honorius stood on a rampart above and gazed upon the scene with a wicked smile on his face. He quickly took a sip from his chalice and chuckled as he commented on the whole situation. "I have been waiting for this moment for a long time. I knew one day you would slip up and do something foolish. It is time, Marcellus. I hope you enjoy the punishment I have in store for you." Thus, Marcellus was forced into the dungeons where he would await his sentence. As for his loved ones, while Aeliana and Siegfrieda may not have much sway in the matter, Placidia had planned to meet with her brother and do whatever was necessary to secure Marcellus' release. Chapter 23 Rebuking an Emperor. You are listening at novelfull.audio. In the city of Rome, its most promising young general currently lies in the depths of the city's dungeons. As he awaited the sentence for his alleged crimes, Marcellus was contained in a cell without the slightest hint of illumination. He sighed heavily as he sat alone in the darkness, reflecting on his previous bout of imprisonment. "This is the second time I have been bound, chained, and covered in my own filth." He made a vow at that moment that he would never again be in this position, no matter what he had to do to ensure his freedom. However, the bitter silence that pervaded in the darkness was eventually interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps and the glowing light that accompanied them. In the end, a single man was standing before the young general's cage with a cruel smile on his face. When Marcellus gazed up at the poorly groomed appearance of the emperor, he merely scoffed before speaking in a sarcastic tone. "Oh joyous me, the emperor himself has come to visit me in my final hours. To what do I owe the pleasure?" It was obviously not Marcellus' final hours as he had not been sentenced to death, still the way he spoke took all the joy out of Honorius' face as he struggled to endure the insult he had suffered just now. "You always were a smartass. Still, I'd like to see you maintain that attitude of yours when I have you flogged naked in the streets." When Marcellus heard of the punishment Honorius had in store for him, he merely chuckled before responding in a similarly light-hearted tone. Are you sure you want to do that? I am pretty well endowed, and if you display my manhood in front of the entire city, I can't tell you how many young women will be flocking to my bedside to aid in my healing. Perhaps I'll invite Placidia to help tend to my wounds. Honorius always found it difficult to endure Marcellus' snarky attitude, however when he heard the man threaten to drag his sister into his bed, he broke out into a fit of fury as he latched onto the bars of the cell, spiting profusely as he screamed at the prisoner. Watch your tongue. You are speaking to your emperor. Mention my sister's name again and I will have it removed. Marcellus gazed arrogantly upon the poorly illuminated face of the young emperor. As always, he had a smug response as he toyed with the fool who presided over Rome over his poor choice of words. So I am free to speak of your sister so long as I don't mention her name. Understood. Upon hearing such nonsense come from Marcellus' mouth, Honorius desired nothing more than to bang his head on the iron bars of the cell. However, he restrained himself. Still, he was beginning to think it was a bad idea to visit Marcellus when he was in prison. After all, the man had a sharp wit and a silver tongue. There was no way a fool like Honorius could beat him in a war of words. Having gazed upon the enraged expression on Honorius' lips, Marcellus smirked before inquiring about the main reason for the emperor's visit. Why are you here, Honorius? Could you really not wait a day to see me in all my glory? Or does it simply make you feel better about yourself to see men better than you bound in chains? An ugly expression formed on Honorius' face as he heard this remark. He could not help but lash out emotionally at his general, rebuking him for his vile comments. You think you're better than me? Before Honorius could finish the rest of his statement, Marcellus nodded his head in silence, further instigating the rage in the emperor's heart. Well, you're not. You're a lowly general, and if it weren't for Stilicho's protection, would have gotten rid of you ages ago. Upon hearing this, Marcellus merely sighed before responding to Honorius' words. You're right, I'm just a lowly general, a boy who lost his father at a young age and worked my way up through the legions until I was stood at the top. A man who slaughtered the enemies of the empire while you laid on your sofa drinking wine and playing with your fucking chickens. Do you know why you despise me so much? Because I am everything you wish to be. Be honest with yourself. Who has done more for Rome, me or you? Honorius merely scoffed when he heard this before attempting to refute Marcellus' grand claims. You think you have done so much for Rome. Then why would you stain our great civilization's honor by offering yourself as a prisoner in the place of a lowly slave? When Marcellus heard this question, he raised his brow before answering in a way that he knew would justify his actions without revealing his feelings for Siegfrieda. Why? Because, unlike you Honorius, it is against my moral beliefs to enable wicked men in their dark desires. If I had handed over my slave to the Bugatti, I would have been condemning her to a fate worse than death. I would rather die as a captive than be responsible for such evil. If our positions were reversed, and say your sister was being demanded as a prize for your safe passage, would you give her up? Of course you would, because a coward like you would sell your soul, let alone your ideals, if it meant buying yourself a few more years of your meaningless existence. By now Honorius was so enraged that the iron bars of Marcellus' cell were rattling from the shaking of the emperor's body. He immediately called out to Marcellus in a threatening tone to remind him of his place in this world. I could have you killed for speaking to me this way. When Marcellus heard this, his smug expression reached a new level of arrogance as he nodded his head before speaking the words Honorius least wanted to hear. You could, but you won't. The emperor did not even think of the trap that Marcellus had laid before him, and quickly spouted off the first thought that had come into his mind as if he was fundamentally incapable of thinking ahead. Oh yeah. And why is that? It was at this point that Marcellus finally stood up from his position and hobbled over to the iron bars of his cell where he stood towering above the feeble emperor. With a smug expression on his face, he revealed the reason he could speak to Honorius in such a disrespectful manner while they were having a private discussion in the dark. Because even you realize that you need men like me to make you look somewhat competent. Without me, and without Stilicho, the people of Rome who you treat as your nothing more than a means of labor would realize what an inept and foolish child you are, and would surely have your head on a spike within a fortnight. So you can act high and mighty all you want, but at the end of the day your reign, and your life, are secure because I kill your enemies for you. How do you repay me for my service? Deny me the glories I have earned and imprison me for a minor offense. For what purpose? To satisfy your petty jealousy. So unless you want your empire to crumble around you, I suggest you let me live, and allow me to do my fucking job. The emperor was dumbstruck when he heard these words. He could not find a proper response. Everything Marcellus had said was true. While Stilicho may be the supreme commander of Western Rome's forces, they needed him in the Italian peninsula to ensure that the Goths did not bare their fangs and invade at the first opportunity given. Aside from Marcellus, Rome had few generals beneath its banner who were capable enough, or loyal enough to put down Constantine's rebellion, and so long as Constantine remained a threat in Gaul, Honorius could not kill Marcellus, no matter how much he wanted to. Despite the poor treatment he had received at the hands of the emperor, Marcellus was still fiercely loyal to the Theodosian dynasty, if not only because of his fondness for Placidia. Thus, all Honorius could do was publicly shame Marcellus for his defeat, and give him a good thrashing. He would not dare to actually remove the man's head, even if it was what he desired most at the moment. The only thing Honorius could do was withdraw himself from the dungeons in defeat, enraged by the verbal humiliation he had suffered at the hands of his prisoner. As for Marcellus, the moment Honorius left the room, he sighed heavily. I really shouldn't have done that. This will only complicate matters further. With that said, Marcellus still remained a prisoner of the indolent emperor, and unless Placidia could convince Honorius otherwise, he would have to walk through the streets naked, while being flogged as a punishment for his actions. Chapter 24 Negotiating on behalf of a prisoner. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Honorius stood within the confines of a large villa in the city of Rome. While he was in the ancient capital, he had chosen this as his place of residence. He was outraged by the verbal lashing he had just received from Marcellus. However, there was nothing he could do about it, as the man was right in everything he said. Honorius needed Marcellus to defeat his enemies for him. Without Marcellus, he would have to dispatch Stilicho beyond the Italian peninsula, leaving it open for another Gothic invasion. It was because of this that the indolent emperor filled his chalice with wine and drowned his dread with alcohol. After the man was good and drunk, he heard a knock on the door, which he quickly answered, revealing the infuriated face of his younger half-sister. Placidia was even more outraged at her brother's actions than Honorius was for Marcellus' words. She had every desire to slap the man across the face, but feared the repercussions and thus stayed her hand. This did not mean, however, that she would not condemn her brother for what he had done. With a voice filled with righteous fury, the young woman berated her emperor for his petty jealousy. Honorius, you bastard! Why are you condemning Marcellus to such a cruel sentence? Has he done something to offend you? If so, you should really leave your personal conflicts out of your judicial decision. It is not a rational way to deal with things. L.R.G. Honorius merely scoffed at his sister's words. Just who did this little bitch think she was? He was the emperor of Rome and he could do what he damn well pleased to his prisoners. Thus, he was not willing to entertain Placidia's pleas for mercy, and instead rebuked her with a hint of fury in his tone. Marcellus is getting what he deserves for humiliating our empire. It is one thing to pay the price of safe passage, but to willingly submit himself to those filthy peasants as their prisoner. That is unforgivable. He must answer for his crimes. The young adolescent girl who was the emperor's sister had a scowl on her pretty face. She could not believe her brother was being so unreasonable and quickly responded to his harsh statement with further indignation. Marcellus may have ruined his reputation by doing such a thing, but he had good reasons to do so. There is no reason to publicly shame him. When Honorius heard this, he took a sip from his chalice, not bothering to refute his sister's words. He had heard the young general's reasoning straight from his mouth, and he was not convinced. There was nobody so noble in this world that they would sacrifice themselves for a lowly slave, simply because they feared what wicked deeds might be inflicted upon the poor soul. There was another reason for why Marcellus had behaved so foolishly, and Honorius was going to find out. Thus it came as a shock to Placidia when he heard his question. What is Marcellus' relationship with this slave? I refuse to believe he traded places with her out of the goodness in his heart. Despite this being an opportunity for Placidia to get rid of her romantic rival, she would never condemn Siegfrieda to a fate worse than death. After all, she knew once her brother realized the position that the barbarian woman held in Marcellus' heart, he would do everything he could to tear them apart. Marcellus may be irreplaceable for the time being, but it was easy for Honorius to get rid of Siegfrieda. Thus Placidia deliberately lied to her brother as she responded with an ignorant facade. As far as I am aware, she is a simple house slave. There is nothing more between the two of them. Honorius may be a drunken fool, but he knew his sister well. He knew she was lying to him about the relationship between Marcellus and Siegfrieda, but he was not willing to call it out. After all, he had no proof, and the girl had a wit sharper than his own. Instead, he drank the full contents of his chalice before responding to the young girl. I will figure out the truth sooner or later, and if I find out that you have lied to me, I will punish you severely. Don't think you are safe just because you are my sister. With these words, Placidia harumphed as she crossed her arms in spite. She did not care what her brother might do to her, she only cared what happened to Marcellus. When she realized she was getting nowhere with her harsh attitude, she shifted to a simply tactic. Kneeling on the floor in front of her brother, Placidia begged for mercy on behalf of Marcellus. Please, brother, spare him. He does not deserve such humiliation. The emperor could not believe his ears. He quickly gazed towards his sister with a look of disdain etched across his face. The girl had begun to cry, whether her tears were real or not he did not know, but they did not have the slightest effect on his blackened heart. He could only respond in a manner which greatly outraged the young woman. Marcellus deserves everything that's coming to him, and more. That bastard actually had the nerve to speak such venom to me. It is clear that he is too prideful, and so it is time someone teaches him some humility. As his emperor, the duty falls to me. Placidia gazed upon her brother in shock. It was at this moment she realized the fool must have visited Marcellus in prison and received a thorough verbal thrashing. She knew her brother well. He was about as dull as a hammer, and despite this thought, he was the most brilliant mind in the empire. It was at this moment a smug expression appeared on Placidia's face as she wiped the tears from her eyes. The girl accurately guessed the reason that Marcellus was so furious. You spoke to him, didn't you? Let me guess, things did not go as well as you thought they would. Oh brother, you should really know better than to start a war of words with someone smarter than you. Placidia's words had pierced the emperor's heart. He could no longer contain his fury after being mocked by both Marcellus and his own sister. He quickly turned around and backhanded the girl across the face, causing her to stare at him in shock. Honorius quickly followed up with an insult to the girl as he condemned her for her words. You will not speak to me in such a manner. If you fancy Marcellus so much, perhaps you would like to share his humiliation. Another word out of you and I will march you through the streets right next to your lover. The emperor's sister felt incredibly wronged by her brother's merciless actions and broke out into tears once more while she ran away from his villa. She left behind her true thoughts on the man as she fled the scene. I hate you. Honorius merely scowled before sitting down on his sofa and reflected on the two conversations he had just endured. His own sister was willing to side with that bastard. It truly enraged him to the core of his being. Stupid bitch, she should know better than to meddle in my affairs. If she wasn't my sister, I would have her killed for her insolence. Suddenly a slithering voice interrupted his train of thought, as a middle-aged man entered the room. This man was none other than Olympus, who was a close advisor to the emperor. He quickly spoke of caution as his venomous words poisoned Honorius's foolish mind. I would advise against that. Though Placidia's words were harsh, she is young, and is bound to rebel against your rule. It is not something you should take to heart. In time, she will mature and will come to know that you are right. Rather, you should focus your attention on Marcellus. After all, he is the one challenging your authority. This punishment you have in mind for Marcellus is only the beginning. The people will lose faith in his ability to command Rome's forces after we march him through the streets naked. When that happens, his influence will wane, and the morale of the troops beneath his command will shatter. Soon his performance will drop, and he will no longer be able to maintain the support of the people. It is then that you can finally be rid of him and the threat he poses to your reign. Honorius sat on his sofa while pouring himself another cup of wine. He gazed into its thick red liquid with a cruel smile on his face. Olympus was right. He needed to get rid of Marcellus, and this act of humiliation was only the first step on his path towards completing this goal. Thus, after reflecting on his advisor's words, he nodded his head in agreement. You speak the truth, Olympus. When the people lose faith in Marcellus, and his troops turn against him, I can finally claim his head. That bastard has been a thorn in my side for too long. Olympus nodded his head with a sinister smile on his face. While Honorius was focused on getting rid of Marcellus purely out of jealousy, his advisor had far grander plans. Marcellus was a small fry and held little influence outside of the military. If Olympus truly wanted to control the foolish emperor, he would need to get rid of his guardian first. Stilicho had to die, and getting rid of Marcellus was the first step to accomplish this feat. Thus, Honorius was playing right into the hands of a vile serpent, who whispered venomous words into the fool's ears, poisoning his mind against his greatest allies. Neither Marcellus nor Stilicho were aware of the conspiracy to claim their lives. Chapter 25 An Act of Humiliation. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The night had come and passed, and in the dawn of the following day Marcellus stood within the city of Rome, bound, chained, and naked. He was not the slightest bit ashamed of his actions, nor his appearance, as he noticed the lustful gazes the women of the ancient capital were giving him. With a slight wink, he immediately gained the favor of many young women, who he knew would be glad to help mend his wounds after his sentence had been fulfilled. Such a shameful response to his predicament caused the men in the crowd to cry out in fury. Many of their wives and daughters had been staring at the chiseled and scarred body of the Roman general since the moment the guards stripped him of his clothes. Traitor! Scum! The men in the crowd hurled their insults while the women said a silent prayer for his safety. After all, the effect of the lash could easily kill a man if he endured too many. Honorius gazed upon the scene with a wicked smile on his face as he issued the sentence to begin. Titus Claudius Marcellus, for bringing humiliation to the glory of Rome, I hereby sentence you to walk in shame towards the cathedral at the lower level of the city, and repent to the Lord God Almighty for your crimes. Marcellus gazed back upon Honorius with a smug smirk on his face, spitting on the floor as if to taunt the emperor, whose face darkened when he witnessed such an unseemly sight. As for Placidia, she was standing by her brother's side, struggling to keep her eyes away from Marcellus' lower half. After all, it was her first time seeing such a thing. When the emperor noticed this, he frowned before issuing the order to commence the sentence. With the wave of a hand, the guards who escorted Marcellus pulled back their whips before leaving a violent lash on the defeated general's back. The sting of the leather strips as they flayed the flesh from his bones nearly brought Marcellus to his knees, however he simply gritted his teeth and endured the process as he marched forward in the streets. As he passed by the uneducated plebeians, they continued to hurl their insults while tossing refuse at him, staining his body with filth. Every few steps, the crack of the whip resounded in the air, and blood spilled onto the stone streets of Rome. At a certain point, Marcellus passed by his villa, where Sigefrida and Aeliana stared at him in disbelief. They never thought that Honorius would make him pay such a heavy price for his mistakes. Sigefrida could feel the icy gaze that her master's mother was giving her from behind, as if the woman blamed her for this unfortunate event. Marcellus gazed upon his slave and mother and simply smiled. However, in the next moment, the whip stripped more flesh from his back, causing the man to grimace in pain. He could not keep up the facade for long, and thus he continued his walk of shame. Siegfrieda had every urge to rush forward and rescue her master when she saw such cruelty inflicted upon him, but Aeliana stopped her by grabbing hold of her wrist and slapping her across the face. "You dumb bitch! He is in this mess because of you. If you try to interfere, you will only worsen his sentence. Learn to use your fucking brain." A red palm print stained itself upon the barbarian woman's otherwise flawless appearance as she welled up in tears. She could not believe she had caused such suffering to her master. The poor girl had every instinct to jump upon Marcella's sword, and pay for his sins with her own life. However, such a thing would only bring him grief, and she could not allow it. Eventually Marcellus reached the doors of the cathedral, where was by now stained in blood and filth. The priests of the chapel washed him down before they allowed him entry. After kneeling down at the altar, he said a simple prayer, not to the Christian God, but to his personal deity, Sol Invictus. "My God, the unconquered Sun, please give me the strength to endure what is to come, and lead my people to glory." He said the prayer in such a low voice that nobody could tell he was worshipping a pagan deity in the house of the Lord. After doing so, he had finished his sentence before collapsing onto the floor of the chapel in a pool of his own blood. Several days passed before Marcellus awoke, lying face down in his own bed. The wounds on his back were covered in medicinal herbs and wrapped in linen. By now, the bleeding had stopped, and he had begun to heal. Though he was still in immense pain, he gazed over at the side of his bed to see Siegfrieda and Placidia kneeling by the bed. There were also a few other young women who he did not recognize. Evidently, they were skilled in healing, as they were the wounds who fixed him up after his walk of shame. Placidia was the first to speak when she noticed the man had opened his eyes. "Marcellus! I'm so happy that you are okay." She quickly grasped hold of his hand, which brought a warm smile to his face. He felt as if he had died and entered Elysium. However, he soon realized he was within his own bedroom, causing him to raise from his slumber. The grimace on his face quickly caused Placidia and Siegfrieda to push him back down while the barbarian beauty chastised him for his recklessness. "Lie down, you fool. Your wounds still have yet to fully heal." When Marcellus heard this, he did as he was instructed and lied back down with an awkward smile. He decided to ease the awkward atmosphere with a joke. "If I knew all it took was a severe lashing to get the two of you to join me in bed, I would have done so a long time ago." Placidia flushed red when she heard this, and tried to cover her embarrassment, but it was no use. Marcellus had seen it and snickered in response. As for Siegfrieda, she flicked him on the forehead before lecturing the man on his choice of words. "Marcellus, you shouldn't have such a filthy mouth in front of a young maiden. Don't you have any shame?" In response to this, Marcellus merely chuckled before sighing heavily. Evidently not, the barbarian beauty could only pout as she heard such a shameless remark. The atmosphere immediately became awkward once more while both women struggled to come up with a light-hearted topic to switch to. That is until Aeliana bust through the door with tears of joy in her eyes. "Marcellus, you're awake." The general's mother quickly rushed towards her son, completely forgetting about his wounds as she hugged him tightly, causing him to grunt in pain. The moment she heard this, she dropped her embrace with a worried expression on her face. "Marcellus, I'm sorry." However, before she could finish her sentence, the young general raised a single finger to his mother's lips and silenced her. "I know." After saying this, he shifted his gaze over to his favorite slave. "Siegfrieda, would you be so kind as to fetch me some wine? I am feeling wraith-parched." "Take the others with you." The Swaby slave would never disobey a command from her master and quickly rose from her kneeling position while nodding her head. "Yes, Dominus." She quickly fled the room with the other girls, who had been looking over him in search of something to quench her master's thirst. When they were out of earshot, Marcellus sat on the edge of his bed and gazed over at Placidia before interrogating her about the emperor. I know that idiot brother of yours won't let me off with a mere walk of shame. What have you heard from him since my sentence? Placidia had an anxious expression on her face as she revealed what little info she had. As far as I know, he seems to be satisfied with your punishment, but I don't trust him. I have never known that fool to be so merciful. I don't know what you said to him in the dungeons, but he is not happy with you. From his tone of voice, I fear he might be conspiring against you. BL.net. Upon hearing such a thing, Marcellus scoffed. No matter what Honorius' plots may be, the man was a fool and could not easily harm him. Thus, he had a confident tone in his voice as he condemned the emperor in front of his little sister. Honorius is too much of an idiot to succeed in whatever simple-minded schemes he may be able to conceive in that addled brain of his. Placidia could not tolerate Marcellus' arrogance and instantly flicked him on his forehead before educating him on the severity of the situation. It's not my brother that I'm worried about. It is that snake Olympus. I don't know what conspiracy those two devils are plotting behind your back, but whatever it may be, it does not bode well for you. The moment Marcellus heard Olympus was involved in the foolish emperor's schemes, he realized things were more dire than he had initially thought. Marcellus had been to the court in Ravenna enough times to know that the man was not to be trifled with. Thus, he could only rely on Placidia to inform him about their movements. Placidia. I know this may be too much to ask of you, but can you watch your brother and his advisor for me? I don't need you to do anything treasonous. Just keep an ear out for whatever they may be plotting against me. The naive girl immediately nodded her head with a smile when she heard this, not realizing that Marcellus had just asked her to spy on the emperor on his behalf. Of course, if I hear anything that might threaten you, I will let you know. Upon hearing this, Marcellus sighed in relief before patting the girl's dyed blonde hair. He uttered a word of caution before sending her on her way. Whatever you do, you must ensure that Honorius and Olympus never find out about this. I fear what they may do to you if they were to notice your eavesdropping. The girl once more nodded her head with a pretty smile on her face. You can count on me, Marcellus. After saying this, the girl left the young general alone with his mother. Completely unaware that she was now acting as a spy on behalf of the man. Chapter 26 Fall from Grace. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Weeks passed, and in that time, Marcellus focused on healing from his wounds. The lash of the whip was no joke. Many had died from the infections that came with such a brutal punishment. Luckily, Marcellus was a wealthy man, and could easily afford the best healers to tend to his ailment. Having spent most of his time lying in bed, Marcellus was quite antsy when he could finally walk around as if he were a spry man in the prime of his youth. Though the carved flesh on his back had scarred, the sting of the whip remained in some phantom capacity. Still, as a man who had suffered grievous injuries on the field of battle, Marcellus was well accustomed to the pain, and walked around as if it did not even bother him. It became increasingly clear in the days following his sentence that Marcellus' reputation was thoroughly ruined. The people of Rome were quick to turn on him, and why wouldn't they? Most human beings had short memories, and would not recollect the past glories a man had achieved, instead they would dwell on his more recent losses. Such petty creatures were quick to condemn the man they once heralded as their defender. It was because of this social isolation from both the plebeian and patrician circles that Marcellus had holed up in his manor. Using the brief time the emperor had given him to heal from his wounds as a sort of vacation. He knew it was only a matter of time before Honorius dispatched him to some battlefield. After all, he was one of the few men capable of defeating Rome's many enemies. At the moment, Marcellus was dining on a fine meal cooked by Sigefrida. Though he had several slaves, the barbarian beauty was undoubtedly his favorite of the bunch, and the only one he trusted to cook his meals. As for his mother, she had returned to her villa after ensuring that her son was on the road to recovery, leaving the boy in the tender care of his many slaves. While Marcellus ate the food that Sigefrida had prepared for him, another one of his slaves, who was a young Assyrian girl, walked into the dining hall with a man in tow. The girl had a sheepish expression on her face as she tried to introduce the man to her master. However, before she could do so, the stranger proudly strode forward and stood before Marcellus with a look of disdain on his face. Though Marcellus did not recognize the man, he could clearly see that he was a member of the Roman army by the uniform he was dressed in. In particular, he was a messenger most likely sent by the emperor himself. Despite Marcellus' superior position, the man did not put on airs, and instead gazed at the young general with disgust before handing him a scroll. "These are orders from the emperor himself. You have been reassigned, the information about your new post is contained in the scroll. If that is all, I will be leaving." Marcellus did not bother wasting his time correcting the man's ill manners, and simply nodded his head, allowing the man to depart from his villa in peace. After the door shut behind the messenger, Marcellus scrolled through the message before tossing it aside with a heavy sigh. Siegfried could immediately tell that it was not good news and immediately moved to comfort his master. "Dominus, is everything all right?" The young general shook his head with a bitter smile on his face. Though expected further retaliation from Honorius, he did not expect the man to go this far. He could hardly look his slave in the eyes as he admitted the reality of his situation. "I've been reassigned." Obviously, he had been reassigned, as the messenger had blatantly said such a thing before departing. However, this did not explain the grim look on her master's face. Thus, Siegfried tried to get to the root of the problem as she wore an optimistic smile. "Well, that's no surprise, your army suffered heavy casualties in Gaul. It makes sense that Honorius would assign you to another comitatenses. It can't be that bad. Which unit are you now in charge of?" Unknowingly, the barbarian beauty had added salt to the mortal blow that Marcellus had just been given by the emperor's hand. He struggled to keep his emotions in check as he tried to explain the depth of his current circumstances to his beloved slave. "You don't understand, he hasn't given me command of a comitatenses, he has tasked me with leading the Limitanii on the borders of Illyricum." Siegfried reacted in shock, and rightfully so. The Limitanii were second-rate frontier soldiers who lived, fought, and died on the borders of the empire. Initially they had started out as professional soldiers, but by now they were part-timers who spent more time farming the fields than they did in battle. When compared to the general's past glories of leading the Palatini, this was considered a major fall from grace. Due to the dire financial situation of the empire, Marcellus' previous army was already considered under-equipped and undertrained. However, when compared to his new troops, the veterans of the Palatini were practically special forces in terms of the quality of equipment and training. To go from leading the empire's greatest forces to being a glorified border guard was an enormous slap to the face, and a waste of Marcellus' talents. Siegfried could hardly believe her master's words and quickly glanced at the message to make sure the man was not pulling a prank on her. The moment she read its contents, her expression sank just as Marcellus had. She immediately protested the order with all the fury in her heart. "Has he gone mad? Placing you in control of a bunch of farmers. You are one of Rome's greatest generals, and he tasks you with leading some pissant frontier fort on the borders of Illyricum. Who will lead the forces against the usurper? This is outright insanity." Marcellus could only click his tongue in his displeasure as he thought about what this meant for his career. It was clear that Honorius intended to have him waste away on the frontier along the borders of the Eastern Roman Empire. The only way he could now climb back to his previous glory was to win a major battle on the frontier against overwhelming odds. Such a thing was unlikely with the quality of troops he was now given command of. It was because of this that the young general was visibly enraged, and had practically begun to shout as he condemned the emperor for his eternal foolishness. "Don't you see? The fool doesn't care about Rome. He would rather watch it burn in the background while acting upon his petty jealousy, than put a capable man who he hates in charge of his armies. I always knew Honorius was an idiot, barely capable of stringing a coherent thought together, but this is utter madness." After saying this, Marcellus glanced over toward Siegfried and noticed she was nodding her head in agreement. She had an anxious expression on her face, as she suspected Marcellus might do something foolish. Obviously, she could not hold her thoughts back and quickly questioned her master. "What do you intend to do about this?" No matter how furious Marcellus was about his current orders, he had no choice but to obey them. Thus, he took a deep breath to calm his nerves as he rubbed his temples before answering the woman's question. "What can I do? I will ride to the borders of Illyricum and defend the land from whatever threat may appear. The emperor has given me an order, and no matter how foolish such an order is, I must obey it. If there was one good thing that came from this whole ordeal is that it would give Marcellus time to experiment with the device he had previously seen in his dreams. Perhaps if he could create these so-called stirrups, he could raise a substantial cavalry force at a fraction of the cost it would take to normally do so. Against the threats on the horizon, such a thing was truly his only hope, as he doubted he could place his faith in the part-time soldiers who would now be beneath his command. Siegfrieda, on the other hand, was extremely worried about Marcellus' new position. The frontier troops were exactly as they sounded, the first line of defense against the myriad of threats on Rome's borders. Undertrained, and under-equipped, Marcellus would soon find himself knee-deep in the blood of Romans and barbarians alike. Compared to the lofty arrangement he had previously had, her master would now be living in a state of constant danger. Yet there was nothing they could do. The emperor's orders were absolute. Thus, Marcellus prepared himself for the long trek to the eastern borders of the Western Roman Empire. Chapter 27. Arriving at the border. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Marcellus had departed from the city of Rome several weeks ago, with only a single slave in tow. He would soon arrive at the province of Rhaetia, where he would live under constant threat from the barbarian hordes. He had been demoted from a leader of the emperor's palace troops to a frontier general. While much of the empire was suffering from countless threats, the Italian peninsula was still somewhat safe to travel, though occasional brigands and raiders would appear. Thus, Marcellus had been dispatched with a small contingent of soldiers to protect him on his journey to the frontier town of Castra Regina. Eventually, the young general could see the township in the distance and noticed it was a far cry from where he was used to living. Unlike the city of Rome, which was protected by the mighty Aurelian walls, the majority of the frontier town was completely unprotected. The only real area of defense was a small stronghold in the center of the village. The rest of the buildings outside this military structure appeared to be nothing more than farmhouses, whose fields appeared to be largely unfertile. If Marcellus was considered a field commander of a massive army in the past, he was now more akin to a feudal lord, presiding over a small town on the borders of the realm. Not only was his job to secure the region from potential threats, but he also had to make sure everything ran as smoothly as possible. If this area wasn't such a turbulent region whose lands had been ravaged by past wars, and whose borders were surrounded by barbarians, then perhaps Marcellus might consider it a comfortable position. Goths, Vandals, and other barbarian tribes existed outside his borders, or at least in such proximity that they could become an immediate threat. Marcellus strode into the township on horseback, where he noticed several members of his new army being derelict in their duties. Unlike the men in his previous army, the majority of these part-time soldiers lacked any form of bodily protection, and only a handful of men had helmets. After all, they had to pay for such luxuries out of their own pocket. Thus, only the most veteran troops could afford a helmet, let alone a mail shirt. When these men saw the proud Roman general on horseback, they immediately halted their activities, and saluted the man while gazing upon the mighty scale armor that adorned Marcellus' chest with envy. Not only did he have a protective vest, but he also wore a gilded helmet, with a proud red plume which acted as a symbol of his authority. Marcellus instantly noticed the jealousy in the eyes of the soldiers, but he simply ignored it. After all, the men quickly shifted their gaze onto Siegfrieda, who wrapped her arms behind him as she rode on the back of Marcellus' horse. Siegfrieda acted with indifference as she noticed the lustful gazes that glanced upon her. Instead, she focused her gaze on the villa within the stronghold. It was a decrepit old building that clearly had not seen maintenance in some time. The barbarian beauty sighed heavily as she gazed upon the quarters she and her master would stay in for the foreseeable future. After riding through the gates of the small stronghold, Marcellus made his way to the villa. He hopped off the horse before helping Siegfried down from her position. As soon as he was safe and secure within the stronghold, the commander of his retinue dismounted from his steed and kneeled before Marcellus with a solemn expression on his face. "General, it has been the highest honor serving you. I must say it is my greatest misfortune that we must part ways here. Unfortunately, we have all been reassigned to another position. We weren't even supposed to protect you on your journey. I just want you to know that we have not forgotten the sacrifices you have made for us, and the soldiers of Rome stand behind you should you ever require our aid." Marcellus gazed at the man with a cold expression on his face. He said nothing, for he could say nothing. He knew exactly what the man was implying, but if he were to even nod his head in silence, it could be considered an act of treason. Instead, he responded within an indifferent tone before dismissing the cavalry commander. "You are dismissed. I will pray to my God that you are victorious in all your endeavors." The commander of the cavalry said nothing more. Instead he mounted his horse and led his soldiers off and back towards the city of Rome where he would regroup with his new unit. After he and his soldiers had made some distance, the commander gazed back on the small frontier fort and uttered a few words beneath his breath. Such a waste. After saying this, he continued on his journey. As for Marcellus, he had marched into the derelict villa, and gazed upon its poor state of astonishment. If he had known it would be in such a neglected condition, he would have brought more slaves with him. After saying this, he realized what he needed to do. Reaching into his coin purse, the general handed a few large gold coins to his slave. "Go to the town market and see if you can find a few slaves for sale. I don't want you to have to clean this mess by yourself. If anyone tries to lay a hand on you, tell them you are the personal slave for the new ducks, and if they dare to harm you, I will have their head." Siegfried silently nodded her head in response to her master's orders and quickly departed from the decaying villa. She rushed out of the fortress and into the nearby town. The streets were nothing more than loose dirt, not even paved with stone. As for the buildings, they were as worn as the manor, if not more so. It was abundantly clear that this town was in an impoverished state. She immediately wondered if Honorius had deliberately selected the worst frontier town for Marcellus to rule over. The moment Siegfried entered the town, she caught the eyes of many men. She was quite obviously a barbarian, and a slave at that. Yet she was among the most beautiful women these frontier folk had ever laid eyes on. Normally Siegfried did not care about such improper glances. However, a particularly hideous bald and fat man approached her with a few goons following behind. These thugs had set their eyes on the woman since they saw her riding on the back of Marcellus' horse. "Hey pretty woman, you seem to be new in town. How about I show you around?" Despite her internal disgust, Siegfried wore a polite expression as she declined the man's offer. "There is no need. I am simply here to buy a couple of slaves, and then I will return to the castro. My dominus is waiting for me." The man did not seem pleased with this response and immediately grabbed hold of Siegfried's forearm as if he was going to force her to follow him. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to insist." Despite his fierce grip, Siegfried managed to pull her arm away from the large man and instantly threatened him, as she had been instructed to do so. "I am the personal slave of the new ducks. If you wish to remain a member of the living, I highly suggest you back off." Benov calm a nearby guard raised his brow when he heard these words. He immediately walked towards the public display of hostility with the intent of interfering. However, before he could do so, one of the other soldiers by his side tried to stop him, shaking his head before reminding him of the position that the fat man held in the village. "Beto may be a fat, disgusting pile of puss, but you know who he is. If you get on his bad side, your family will go hungry when winter comes." While the soldier warned his comrade of the consequences of messing with the fat man, a large slap resounded in the air. Siegfried had become annoyed by Beto's egregious behavior and swatted him, leaving a small red handprint on his face. With a dominating presence that should not belong to a slave, the Swaby beauty condemned the man in front of the whole town. "Scoundrel! I will have your head for this." Evidently, the man had groped her chest, which caused the woman to respond with such fury. However, Beto's face immediately darkened as he gazed upon the proud slave with a hint of hatred in his dark eyes. Just when he was about to retaliate, the soldier stepped forward and unleashed his blade with a murderous aura. "Beto, stay your hand if you wish to keep it. This is the Dux's slave, and no harm shall come to her without his permission. If you resist, I am afraid I will have to bring you before the man himself." The large man named Beto spat on the ground in disgust. A man in his position did not fear a mere Dux. In fact, without Beto, many of the citizens would starve to death every winter. He dared to see how this new general would punish him. "Ordius! You dare stand in my way? You should think twice if you want to survive the winter." The soldier named Ordius did not sheath his blade, nor did he back away in fear. There was only a single reason that would compel an average part-time soldier to stick up for the slave of a disgraced general. That was because, unlike his brothers in arms, he recognized the Marcellus the moment he first arrived in the village. If he did not oppose Beto now, then many heads would roll should the fat man have his way with the beautiful slave. Thus, a showdown had begun to take place in the middle of the small border town. One that could have serious consequences on the people who lived there. Chapter 28 Assuming Control. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Gaius Licinius Ordius gazed upon the fat old thug with a look of disdain across his scarred face. Under normal circumstances, he would simply ignore Beto's criminal activities, as the man had significant control over the town's resources. However, things were different this time. The woman he was trying to force to accompany him and his band of thugs was no mere slave, but the personal property of a man that Ordius deeply feared and respected. Thus he held his sword at the ready, prepared to engage in mortal conflict with the band of thugs if it meant saving the town from Marcellus' wrath. "I will give you one final warning, Beto, stay your hand or you will lose it. I am not afraid to fight to the death for this woman's safety." Siegfrieda gazed towards the young man, who had stood up for her with a complicated expression on her pretty lips. The soldier's voice and appearance seemed familiar, but she could not quite identify him. However, before she could come to a conclusion, the fat and bald man named Beto broke out into laughter as he pulled out a dagger and held it to Siegfrieda's neck. "You think I am afraid of you? This woman is my hostage. If you dare to take one step closer, I will cut her throat." When Ordius saw such a shameless action, he gritted his teeth in frustration. He did not expect the man to be so foolish. If he did not save Siegfrieda from this unscrupulous merchant and his band of thugs, then he knew the entire town would bleed. He had no other option but to try and reason with the man. "Beto, you fool! Do you have any idea whose woman that is?" Beto merely smirked when he heard this before rebuking the brave soldier. "It doesn't matter if she is the Dux's bitch, so long as she is within this town. If I want her, nobody can stop me." Ordius was about to challenge the man's claim when a voice interrupted him. Although this voice sounded calm on the surface, there was a hint of fury contained deep within its pronunciation. "Oh really? Are you challenging my authority as the Dux of Castra Regina? You are quite bold to take my slave hostage. I swear to you that should you harm a hair on that woman's head, I will personally flay the flesh from your bones." The bald fat man immediately gazed over at the man who spoke these words. To his surprise, the new Dux had arrived in person. The man stood behind Ordius clad in his armor, with his helmet removed and clutched under his arm. There was a stern expression on his face as he gazed upon Beto with a hint of disdain in his eyes. Before Beto could respond to the general's claim, Marcellus snapped his fingers and gave out his orders to the nearby garrison. "Shield wall." Though the Roman soldiers of the Limitanii were initially hesitant to interfere on behalf of the slave. However, the moment their new general gave the order, they quickly followed their instructions. While they may not be the elites of the Roman army, they still had spears, and shields which they quickly surrounded Beto and his group of thugs with. The ugly fat man was practically sweating blood as he gazed upon the Roman soldiers, who now surrounded him with no way out. Though he deeply desired to partake of the flesh that belonged to this barbarian beauty, ultimately he was forced to release her, where the woman quickly fled to her master's arms. Ordius immediately sighed in relief when he saw that the situation had been handled without bloodshed. However, before he could truly catch his breath, a shocking order was declared by the new ducks. Kill them. The soldiers who composed of Marcellus' army gazed upon their new general with wary expressions. If they killed Beto now, there was no way they would be able to import the grain necessary to feed their families when winter came. After all, Beto was a black market dealer who imported food and resold it at exorbitant prices. However, despite these immoral actions, the people of Castra Regina relied on his products for survival during the harsher seasons. When Beto saw the unwillingness of the Roman soldiers to take his life, he broke out into a fit of laughter before condemning Marcellus as a fool in front of the whole town. You see, you may hold the title of ducks, but the people in this town rely on me to feed them. Without me, many of these soldiers of yours will starve when winter comes. I can do whatever I want in this town and nobody can stop me. Marcellus glared at his soldiers with a furious expression. Refusing to follow his orders was a death sentence. Normally, he would have all these men flogged before being beaten to death for insubordination. He was about to assert his dominance over the soldiers when Ordius interrupted him. Ordius tried to convince Marcellus to be reasonable. No matter how much he despised Beto, the man was needed for the town's survival. Sir, with all due respect, you should be lenient. He didn't harm your girl, and what he said is true. When Marcellus finally gazed upon the face of the man who stepped forward to defend his slave, he had a hard time believing his eyes. However, once he realized this man's identity, a wicked grin curled itself upon his lips before making his intention clear. Ordius, since when have you ever known me to be merciful? After saying this, Marcellus intimidated his men into action. He gazed upon the soldiers of the Limitanii and issued his decree. If you refuse to follow my orders, I will have to resort to the ancient rite of decimation. Choose now to live as soldiers under my command, or find yourselves beaten to death by your brothers in arms. Decimation was an ancient ritual that had fallen out of practice centuries ago. By now, it was extremely uncommon. Despite this, such action was still fully within Marcellus' ability to abuse. The practice of decimation was usually used as a punishment for a unit who had deserted from the field of battle. Though it could also be enacted upon a rebellious troop. The moment the Roman soldiers heard they would be forced to endure decimation, they immediately found their resolve to do as commanded. Without a second of hesitation, the soldiers thrust their spears forward and into the bodies of Beto and his thugs. The confident smirk on the fat man's face immediately vanished and a spear head protruded through the back of his heart, replaced entirely with an expression of disbelief. Had he really been killed over such a petty matter? Such were the last thoughts of the unscrupulous merchant known as Beto. The moment he fell to the ground as a lifeless corpse, the villagers who had gathered to witness the scene jeered towards their new ducks. You bastard! You have killed us all. How am I supposed to feed my children when winter comes? However, despite the fury of the mob, Marcellus immediately calmed their growing wrath as he assured them they would not starve. People of Castra Regina, I do not know how the previous ducks of this land handled his affairs, but I promise you that under my leadership, no man, woman, or child who lives within the confines of my territory shall starve. Even if I have to resort to buying grain from other villages, I will ensure that you are all well fed by the time winter comes. Men like this are scum of the earth who have bled this village dry. You are all better out without them. Though the people knew Beto had been sucking the marrow from their bones, they had no choice but to pay the hefty price if they wished to survive. However, this new ducks claimed he would ensure they were well fed. If he could not live up to his claims, there would certainly be riots. For now, the people of Castra Regina placed their trust in the man, as they calmed their wrath and returned to their homes. They would like to see just how the new ducks performed before they resorted to violence. As for Marcellus, he gazed towards Ordius, who was sweating like a pig in heat, and smiled at the man before greeting him. "I never thought I would have run into you here, of all places. You have changed." Ordius bowed his head with respect to the general before responding to the man. "Oh, I have you to thank for that. If you had not punished me so severely, I would probably be a corpse by now, or worse, a slave. Much has changed in the years since I served beneath your command. I must say it is an honor to follow you once more, General." Marcellus gazed into the distance towards the city of Rome as he wrapped his arm around Siegfried's shoulders. He nodded his head before uttering the words in his mind. Much has changed indeed. With this, Marcellus had uprooted a criminal element of his town and had displayed his authority as the dux of the region. In the coming days, he would work to restore the town to its former glory while building his army. If there was one thing Marcellus could be thankful for about this new position was the fact that he had absolute control over the region. Perhaps here on the edges of the world, he could build an army that even the mighty legions of the Principate would admire. Chapter 29 Changing the Course of Warfare. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After slaying the corrupt merchant and his band of thugs, Marcellus was quick to purchase a few slaves to help restore his villa. His actions, while brutal, had secured his position as the leader of the stronghold and the village that surrounded it. Weeks had passed following these events, and the villa that Marcellus stayed in was fully restored to its former glory. During this time, Marcellus had been busy overseeing the training of his new army. It became abundantly clear very quickly that these part-time warriors were severely lacking in physical fitness, protective equipment, and even the fundamentals of combat that made a unit strong. Every day after the soldiers finished their work in the fields, Marcellus would host a training session where the men were forced to do push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups, and squats. They were also required to do a 5-mile run, with rucksacks that had been filled with rocks. After they had completed this exercise, the soldiers would drill formations and basic combat commands, turning the unarmored infantry of the Limitanii into a cohesive fighting force. Though it had only been a few weeks, the extensive training the men were put through formed unshakable bonds as they endured the torment of their general's commands. A few soldiers of note proved themselves to be more reliable than their peers. Shockingly, one of these men was Ordius. A man who Marcellus had served with years prior. In the past, Ordius had proven unreliable and had committed certain acts that resulted in severe punishment. Marcellus did not know what the man had endured these past few years, nor was he aware of how he made his way to Castra Regina, but it would appear the man had gotten his act together and become a diligent soldier of the empire. It was because of this that Marcellus had promoted the man to the position of his right hand. At the moment, Marcellus and Ordius were having a conversation as they made their way to the village blacksmith. "You really think this design of yours will have a major effect on warfare? Aren't you being a bit too hopeful?" Despite the commander's skepticism, Marcellus was undeterred. If his strange dreams were in fact visions from the gods, then this device would be revolutionary to how warfare was conducted. Now that he had some free time, the young general had commissioned a new saddle, which included a set of stirrups. He had already contacted a local tanner who had agreed to his request. The next part of his plan included commissioning a set of iron loops to secure his feet. If my theory is proven correct, these stirrups will change the course of warfare. We will soon be able to raise cavalry at a fraction of the cost, while allowing them to be more efficient in their attacks. Ordius had seldom seen Marcellus as excited as he was now. However, it was not like the man was using the funds of the settlement's treasury to fund this little experiment. Thus, Ordius could care less about what the wealthy bastard used his personal fortune for. Eventually, the duo made their way to the local blacksmith's shop. The man in question was large and muscular, with a full beard and dark hair. He appeared to be working on the manufacture of a set of horseshoes while Marcellus approached. Though the man saw that the new dux was visiting his shop, he did not halt his activities and greet him. Instead, he acted indifferently as he continued to hammer away at the horseshoes. Ultimately, Ordius spoke up on his general's behalf. "Cadus, you old bastard, are you really not going to show respect to the new ducks?" The old man simply grunted in displeasure as he continued to batter away at the iron horseshoes. Upon seeing that the man did not care in the slightest about Marcellus' position, the young general decided to quickly get to business as he pulled out his blueprint of the iron stirrups. "I need you to create this for me. I promise I will pay you a fair price for your work." Upon seeing that the ducks had approached him with a business proposal, the man looked at the blueprint and nodded his head in silence before raising 5 fingers. Marcellus could clearly understand what the man meant. The man was clearly asking for 500 nummi. The nummus was the lowest quality coin in the empire, and was generally made of copper. In comparison, 1 solidus, which was the most valuable coin of the empire, was worth 7,200 nummi. Marcellus had no problem affording such an expense. After all, his father had left him a treasury filled with solidus coins. If he so desired, he could bathe in the amount of gold coins he had access to. He quickly reached into his coin pouch and pulled out 1 millierence, which was a large silver coin worth approximately 600 nummi. He tossed the coin over to the blacksmith, who quickly caught it and gazed upon the general with suspicion. Marcellus responded to the man's expression with a simple phrase. "You can keep the change." After witnessing the general's generosity, the man nodded his head in silence, however his stoic expression appeared to have lightened a bit, as if he had a more favorable impression of Marcellus. With the price paid, the young general quickly inquired about the time frame where the product could be delivered to him. "How long will it take to complete it?" The man was decisive with his response as he raised 3 fingers, each one representing a day. It became apparent to Marcellus that the blacksmith named Cadus was not the most talkative person in the world. However, he asked for clarification to ensure he was understanding the man correctly. 3 days. The blacksmith nodded his head in silence before returning to his work. Marcellus was satisfied with the time frame that was given to him for delivery and thus walked back to his villa with Ordius by his side. "So Ordius, now that today's work is over, are you going to visit the local brothel?" The man wore a bitter smile as he shook his head before responding to his general. "No sir, those days are behind me. In the past I could not wait to spend my coin on women and wine, but nowadays I have found my purpose in defending this settlement from the threat of the Goths. You never know when they will try to cross into our borders and raid our lands." Marcellus nodded his head as he heard these words. It was true that on the eastern border of Castra Regina, the Goths lie in wait, preparing for their invasion. There was only so much time in the world before the peaceful days that Marcellus currently enjoyed were drowned in a river of blood. He had to spend every moment preparing his troops for that eventuality. Fierce resolve filled Marcellus' olive-green eyes as he asked the question on his mind. "When Alaric finally shows his face, do you think we will be able to stop him here in Castra Regina?" Ordius gazed into the direction of the village and sighed heavily before answering. "Before you were assigned here, I would say we were destined to die bloody. However, the changes you have made to the soldiers' training just might be enough to keep us from drowning. Though I won't lie, it will be a difficult task." Marcellus sighed and nodded his head before responding to this claim. "It would appear I am going to have to invest in more than just time in my army if we wish to survive. Perhaps I should buy some proper equipment for the men. Once they have proven their resolve, that is." Ordius raised his brow when he heard this. He had never expected Marcellus to be so generous with his wealth. Just what was the man planning if he was willing to invest in arms and armor for a bunch of Limitanii? Somehow, the idea of being supplied with such expensive equipment did not fill the veteran soldier's heart with relief, but rather worry. He could only think of one reason that Marcellus might be willing to waste such a fortune, and the thought sent shivers down his spine. Marcellus did not take notice of this hesitation and instead continued to his villa. The moment he made it back home safely, he bade the commander farewell. I will speak to you further tomorrow. There is much we need to discuss about the continued training of our soldiers. Until then, enjoy these peaceful days, for I fear they will not last much longer. Ordius saluted his general before departing, where he quickly returned to his quarters within the stronghold. He knew that if anyone were capable of deterring the Goths from sacking Castra Regina, it was Marcellus. Whether they could truly survive the coming days, Ordius did not know, but he had to do everything in his power to convince the part-time soldiers of the region to stand and fight. Thus, while Marcellus relaxed in his villa, Ordius was hard at work at the local tavern, raising the morale of the soldiers. Chapter 30 A New Era of Cavalry. You are listening at novelfull.audio. On the eve of the third day, following Marcellus' order of stirrups, the man in question was fast asleep. In his dreams, another vision had come to him. It was a discussion from the perspective of Frank Caruso, with a friend of his from college. The two men were in the basement of the friend's house playing war games. With a haughty smile, Frank moved his heavy cavalry into place as they flanked the enemy. After a roll of the dice, it was determined that his attack had dealt a critical blow to the enemy forces, causing his friend to lose many of his elite troops. The young man cursed at Frank as he gazed upon the devastation that had been done to his miniature army. "You bastard! You took out my fire wizards. How am I supposed to beat you now?" Despite his friend's protests, Frank was in a good mood. He knew the young man's comments were not hostile in the least, and were merely friendly banter exchanged between two men. Instead, he had a shit-eating grin on his face as he poured salt on the wound. "Bah, fire wizards! You seriously think that such petty magic tricks can contend with the might of a couched lance? You have much to learn, my friend." The friend looked at Frank with a pitiful expression. He knew Frank was flouting his history degree in his face. Even though he did not want to sit through another one of the man's lectures, he knew that it was going to happen either way. Thus, the young man bit the proverbial bullet as he asked what his friend was talking about. "What the hell is a couched lance?" A smug expression was on Frank's lips. He always loved talking about his area of study, so much so that his friends and family found it tedious. However, he couldn't help it. He was passionate about history, and thus had come to see himself as an educator of the ignorant. "You seriously don't know what a couched lance is? Okay, so you know what stirrups are, right? Basically, some time after stirrups were invented, some unknown genius had the idea to hold the lance in a special way beneath their shoulder. This provided stability for the lance, allowing for serious damage to be inflicted on his foe, when the lance collided with the speed of the horse. The reason why such a tactic was never used before the invention of stirrups was because there was nothing to keep the rider seated. If he dared to do such a thing, he'd probably end up falling off his horse. The friend scowled at Frank as he watched the man shamelessly perform the gesture of couching his imaginary lance. This guy wasted all of his brainpower on something so worthless. Just when the hell would he ever need to know how to couch a lance? Eventually, he ignored Frank's comments and shifted his attention towards his crumbling lines of defense. "No wonder you cut through my wizards then, if even a heavily armored knight would meet his end against such a tactic." Marcellus awoke with a sweat, as he gazed over at his side where Sigefrida lay asleep. He did not know why he was having another dream about stirrups, but despite the strange occurrence, there was some useful information in the vision. He quickly got out of his bed and got dressed. After all, the sun was rising, and today was the day he could finally test his newest invention. Hours passed and Marcellus was waiting patiently in front of the blacksmith known by the name of Cadus. For the first time, Marcellus had heard the man's voice as he spoke up about the stirrups. It was a deep and gruff voice befitting the man's masculine appearance. "As promised, I have made your devices. If that is all, I have other matters to attend to." Marcellus did not take offense at the blunt nature of the man, and instead thanked him for his help. "Thank you, Cadus. If these work out as planned, I will be back for more orders later." Despite Marcellus' offer of future business, the blacksmith ignored him, and instead began cutting out some iron nails. The man's work was never truly finished. There were a lot of things that needed to be made of iron in the village, and he was one of the few blacksmiths in the region who could fulfill such a task. Marcellus paid no heed to this and instead took his stirrups to the tanner, who by now would be finished with his new saddle. The tanner had an excited look on his face as noticed the general's approach and quickly greeted him. Unlike Cadus, he was a much more sociable person. "Dux, come take a look. I have completed the saddle you have asked for." Marcellus gazed upon the fine leather saddle with a hint of pride in his eyes. It was made of a chestnut-brown leather, and was truly fitting for a man of his position. After closely examining the saddle, he attached the iron stirrups before nodding his head to the tanner. "Excellent job. If my experiment works, you will be the first to know, as I will need quite a few more of these new saddles." The tanner smiled and nodded his head. Afterward, Marcellus ordered his personal guard to carry the saddle back to his villa. He planned to test the device out himself. As he turned to leave, the tanner thanked him for his business. "I look forward to your results." Marcellus nodded his head with a smile on his lips before returning to his villa, where the stables kept his personal steed. It was a fine horse of noble lineage, who had been Marcellus' mount for many years. The stallion had a chestnut-colored coat, and a white spot on its forehead. Marcellus calmed the horse as he equipped its saddle. "Behave yourself, Romulus." The steed, named Romulus, was obedient as Marcellus took a deep breath before putting one foot into the stirrup and hoisting himself onto the beast's back. He calmed himself once both feet were secured in the iron fittings before commanding the steed to take a slow trot forward and out of the stables. Though the sensation was strange, Marcellus soon became used to the stirrups and had finally mustered the courage to usher the horse forward at a faster speed. He guided the beast into the field as several targets had been prepared in advance for the experiment. After arriving at the area, a soldier handed him a lance, and a shield where Marcellus snapped the reins, ordering a full charge at the target. Marcellus followed the instructions from his dream as he clumsily couched the lance beneath his arm and charged towards the straw target, which was covered in a mail coat at full speed. When his lance collided with the target, it pierced through the riveted mail armor as if it was made of butter, bringing a smile to his face. Not only did he pierce through the armor of the straw target, but his lance had practically gone out the other side. Despite the speed at which he had struck the target, Marcellus was still seated on horseback. When the soldiers watching him saw this, they were shocked, believing he would surely fall off his horse at such speeds. The stirrup solved many problems with cavalry. For starters, it made it incredibly easy to mount the horse. Before this invention it took significant training just to be able to properly mount a horse. Secondly, it made it easier to ride the horse. The amount of training required to stay seated on your mount was extensive. This was no longer the case with the invention of stirrups. Finally, the stirrups allowed the rider to remain seated even at high-speed collisions, making it ideal for cavalry. This was one simple test. Marcellus rode back and forth between the many targets at breakneck speeds, using his couched lance to thrust through whatever defenses were in its path. He spent several hours conducting experiments on the use of stirrups, and the many weapons that cavalry utilized. He was particularly fond of its capabilities, with heavy cavalry and horse archers. By the time the sun went down, Marcellus regrouped with Ordius, and outlined his findings in an extensive report. "It would appear my suspicions were correct. The stirrup greatly increases the controllability and maneuverability of the rider. I suspect it makes learning how to ride easier, as it is a simple task to mount the horse, let alone stay on it. With these devices, we could raise a troop of cataphracts in a fraction of the time it would normally take. Years of training could be halved with this invention. Not to mention the role it plays in horse archery. My friend, I think I have just started a new era of cavalry warfare." Ordius gazed upon his commander with shock in his eyes. Cataphracts were among the best cavalry units in the empire. If they could be raised with less training and expense, it could be a game changer. He quickly nodded his head before responding to Marcella's summary. Tomorrow morning, I will begin requisitioning as many mounts and saddles so that we can begin raising cavalry forces. Though we might not be able to afford cataphracts at the moment, we can still make a significant difference on the battlefield with this discovery. Marcellus nodded his head in agreement. The invention of the saddle would change warfare as the world knew it. It might even be able to aid him in his future battles with the Goths. He had no time to waste and quickly approved of the idea. After speaking of these issues, the two men departed. There was much work to be done, and not enough time in the world to fulfill it.